This is the history of a weapon forged in the hollows of pure panic, a monstrosity of steel whose design flaws were so abyssal they nearly decapitated their own inventors. While propaganda hallowed it as an invincible colossus, for its crews, it frequently mutated into a 47-ton thermal sarcophagus with no possibility of escape. Why were Soviet engineers forced to pillage and copy German mechanical components just to prevent their own supergun from self-destructing upon firing? For what absurd reason, amidst the rubble of Berlin, did they weld bed springs onto the armour while, behind the steel, men suffered atrocious ends, imprisoned by hatches thermally fused shut by the flames? We shall exhume the hidden archives of an anachronistic predator, possessed of a rate of fire more suited to the 19th century, whose grotesque career did not officially conclude until the year 1995. Forget everything you thought you knew about technological superiority. This is the brutal, illogical, and terrifying truth about the IS-2. It was the winter of the year 1942 to 1943, a period when the Soviet armoured industry was thrust into a reality that can only be described as a technical grotesque. On the front, the sudden emergence of the new German mastodons of the Tiger type sent a seismic shockwave through the high command. The Soviets were forced to realise with horror that their entire combat fleet had become instantaneously archaic. Neither the celebrated T-34 nor the heavy KV-1 could dent the armour of this steel beast, whose frontal protection was practically inviolable, while the German 88mm gun transformed Soviet vehicles into smoking carcasses at a distance of 2,000 metres. It was within this climate of paranoia and technological inferiority that a frantic hunt for an answer began, culminating in a machine whose genesis is a tapestry of contradictions and engineering curiosities. The ancestry of this new heavy tank, christened with the patronymic title of Joseph Stalin, traces back to a lineage whose absurdity borders on the surreal. The base structure was not borrowed from a proven model, but from the KV-13, an experimental hybrid, a true chimera between a medium and a heavy tank, about which even experts possessed only contradictory information, and which was rightly considered a failed project. Nevertheless, in February of 1943, the State Defense Committee demanded the immediate production of 2 prototypes. To crown this lack of conceptual cohesion, it was decided to fit the same chassis with 2 radically opposed armament concepts, as if the engineers were incapable of deciding whether they were building a main battle tank or a mobile artillery carriage. The first prototype, designated as Object 233 or IS-1, was equipped with a 76mm gun of the ZIS-5 type. This was a decision of remarkable futility, as that exact calibre had already proven totally ineffective against the new German armour. A brand new heavy tank was being built only to be armed with a weapon incapable of harming its adversary. The second prototype, Object 234 or IS-2, received instead a 122mm U-11 tank howitzer, housed in a turret borrowed from the experimental KV-9 tank. Here, the pendulum swung to the other extreme. They possessed a monstrous calibre, but a howitzer with such low muzzle velocity was entirely unfit for direct tank-to-tank combat, turning the vehicle into a sort of armoured catapult. The trials of these 2 disunited brothers took place in March and April of 1943, leaving an impression that was, at best, mediocre. While the Commission praised a superior design density and more massive armour than the KV-1S, the technical flaws were profound. The running gear was on the verge of collapse. On soft ground, the track links sagged disproportionately into the gaps between the road wheels, generating a colossal rolling resistance that paralysed mobility. The engineers dryly recommended increasing the number of road wheels on future models, but the original sin of a rushed design remained. As the factories were barely preparing for the serial production of these dubious prototypes, brutal reality once again overtook the Soviet planners. In April of 1943, precise data on the Tiger's armour protection was finally obtained. The analysis was devastating, showing that the entire previous development program had been a gargantuan waste of time. It became evident that neither the 76mm gun nor the howitzer could effectively stop the German Predator. In the midst of industrial preparations, everything was ground to a halt. The narrative shifted radically. It was no longer just about having a new tank, but about forging a weapon capable of pulverizing steel plates 100mm thick. The current prototypes, before even leaving the assembly line, were already relics. The arms race had to begin anew, and the solution lay no longer in evolution, but in a radical and violent technological leap, even at the cost of shattering the physical limits of what could actually fit inside a tank turret. In the late days of April in the year 1943, at the proving grounds of the Armoured Research Institute in Kubinka, a captured German Tiger tank was literally executed at the stake of ballistic science to determine empirically which caliber could even disturb this iron colossus. The verdict of these firing sessions was scathing, revealing the total impotence of the existing arsenal. Only the 85mm 52K anti-aircraft gun succeeded in piercing the 100mm of frontal armour of the German machine at a distance of 1,000 metres. Based on this finding, the order was issued to integrate the ballistics of this air defence piece into a tank, leading to the creation of Object 237. However, physical realities do not bend to mere decrees. It was quickly realised that the existing turret ring diameter, at a mere 1,535mm, was far too cramped to accommodate such a weapon, without completely paralysing the crew's operational capacity. The engineers were forced to widen the turret ring to 1,800mm, which triggered a chain reaction of structural mutations. The entire hull had to be stretched by 420mm just to support the new turret. This elongation of the chassis in turn necessitated the addition of a sixth road wheel on each side, driving the total weight up to 44 tons and degrading the tank's dynamic properties before it ever saw its first engagement. While in July of 1943 comparative tests between various gun variants continued, and the tank designated as the IS-85 was briefly favoured, Chief Designer Joseph Kotin had already grasped that even this calibre was but a stopgap. Analysis of the Battle of Kursk demonstrated unequivocally that only the powerful 122mm A-19 core gun was a remedy capable of shattering German heavy armour with absolute certainty, leading to the daring idea of forcing this monstrous artillery piece into the confined space of a tank turret. To realise this plan, which bordered on technical madness, the engineers employed a modular construction method, mating the barrel of the A-19 with the cradle and recoil mechanism of the experimental U-11 howitzer, as this was the only way to make the titanic recoil forces even remotely manageable. The risky and improvised nature of this development was dramatically revealed during a demonstration before Marshal Kliment Voroshilov at a training ground near Moscow. When the first test shot was fired, the T-shaped muzzle brake failed to withstand the enormous gas pressure and shattered into 1,000 fragments, with the Marshal escaping injury only by pure chance, nearly bringing the project to a premature and humiliating end. Following this debacle, a more robust German-style muzzle brake was hastily copied and fitted, bringing the irony of this technical development to perfection. It was now a Germanic component helping to make the Russian supergun functional. Despite these manifest defects and the permanent danger to the crew itself, the tank was officially accepted under the designation IS-122 by the State Defense Committee, as Stalin was personally impressed by the brutality of the caliber and ordered the production of the weapon with a semi-automatic wedge breech. Yet, in the euphoria over the colossal firepower and the spectacular destruction of a decommissioned Panther tank on the firing range, it was deliberately overlooked that a monster had been sired whose interior was so congested by the giant munitions that it carried fatal tactical handicaps. The first series production vehicles rolled toward the front, but the crews would soon discover that the immense size of the shells and the two-part loading procedure imposed a lethally slow rate of fire, destined to place them in mortal peril in the heat of the fray. Behind the thick wall of steel lay an architecture that could be described, with some benevolence, as a tapestry of compromises, or more honestly, as a logistical nightmare. For the integration of the formidable 122mm D-25T gun demanded an exorbitant tribute in the form of a derisively anemic rate of fire. Because the ammunition, owing to its colossal weight and extraordinary dimensions, could not be handled as a single unit, it necessitated a separate loading procedure where the loader had to first ram the shell and then the casing containing the propellant charge into the breech. While a German loader could smoothly slide 3 shells into his gun, the Soviet crew struggled drenched in sweat to prepare a single shot, throttling the fire rate to a theoretical 1.5 to 2 rounds per minute, a performance that, in the chaos of actual combat was often even more lamentable. Even more tragic than this lethargic reloading was the drastic reduction of the ammunition stowage to a mere 28 shells, which, compared to the 114 rounds of the preceding KV-1S, felt like a cruel strategic joke, rapidly transforming this heavy tank into a defenceless block of iron during any sustained engagement. This Colossus was propelled by a 12-cylinder V2IS diesel engine developing 520 horsepower, transmitting its power to the tracks through a system that, by Soviet standards, was perceived as a technological revolution. For the first time, planetary gear sets were utilised for the steering mechanisms, granting the heavy IS-2, despite its massive bulk, a superior agility compared to the German Tiger and allowing it to maintain a higher average speed across broken terrain. However, the hull protection remained initially a fatal flaw, as early models featured a stepped frontal glacis whose structure was severely weakened by a driver's vision slit cut directly into the main armour plate. Firing trials proved that this configuration had a nefarious tendency to crack and send showers of secondary spall into the crew compartment, even when the enemy projectile failed to fully penetrate the armour. It was not until the introduction in 1944 of the so-called straight nose, a massive plate sloped at 60 degrees and stripped of that dangerous vision slit, that the machine's front finally became immune to German 88mm guns, even at point-blank range. Yet, all these technical specifications on paper could not mask the fact that the machine, though titanic, remained an absolute enigma to crews hastily retrained from simple T-34s. The soldiers were unaccustomed to the peculiarities of separate loading, or the specific doctrine of employing a heavy breakthrough tank, and this inexperience, coupled with immature technology, would be paid for at an atrocious price. The 1st Guard regiments were hurled into the furnace of battle with their machines fresh from the factory floor, and what was planned as a triumphant demonstration of Stalinist technical supremacy began to mutate irredeemably into a bloody debacle near the settlements of Lysyanka and Uman, where the latest technological jewels would end up consumed in flames before they could ever fulfill their high-flown expectations. In February of the year 1944, the hastily assembled Guard regiments, whose crews often possessed not a single shred of experience with heavy armour, were hurled into the primeval mud of Ukraine. Near Lysyanka, the 13th Regiment immediately received a searing lesson in tactical naivety. Instead of employing these massive iron fists as a concentrated breakthrough ram, 5 IS-2 tanks were dispatched in isolation into a textbook ambush to support already decimated T-34s. There they were greeted by a hail of fire from camouflaged German units at a distance of 600 to 800 metres. In the span of a mere 10 minutes, all 5 heavy machines were neutralised, with each vehicle statistically absorbing between 3 and 7 direct hits. 2 of them were transformed into roaring pyres, pulverising the myth of invulnerability before the first real victory could even be claimed. This black streak of misfortune continued on the 5th of March near Uman, where 5 additional tanks were eliminated by the surgical fire of 88mm anti-aircraft guns, while another vehicle, in a tragedy bordering on the farcical, plunged off a bridge and overturned due to a driver's elementary error. Particularly humiliating for the design bureaus was an incident reporting that the lower hull armour of an IS-2 had been pierced not by a heavy field gun, but by a Panzerfausts 41, a heavy anti-tank rifle featuring a tapered bore that shrunk from 28 to 20mm, a weapon that appeared almost derisory when placed against such a colossus. These events forced a brutal tactical reappraisal upon the High Command, as the tank proved vulnerable in direct short-range duels. This was further confirmed in an engagement near Starokonstantinov against the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, at distances exceeding 1,500 metres. While the IS-2 managed to damage the tracks and guns of the German Tigers, they were unable to land a single decisive lethal blow. However, the crews quickly realised that the true potential of their machine lay not in hunting agile targets, but in harnessing the sheer kinetic brutality of the 122mm OF-471 high-explosive shells. The detonation of such a massive high-capacity explosive shell released an energy so violent that it was not strictly necessary to penetrate the armour to neutralise the adversary. The raw power of the blast wave was often sufficient to burst weld seams, devastate internal components, or, in extreme cases, literally shear a German tank's turret from its ball bearings through pure mechanical overload. This capacity to pulverize concrete bunkers and halt heavy vehicles through blunt force made the IS-2 an effective instrument of breakthrough. Yet, just as the Soviet tankers were learning to exploit the weaknesses of the first-generation Tiger, the German armaments industry was preparing a terrifying surprise. By the end of 1944, reports signalled the arrival of an even more imposing monster, heavier and better protected, the Tiger Type II, ready to push the arms race of calibers to a new summit of escalation. On the 12th of January in the year 1945, during the Vistula-Oder offensive, the village of Lisow became the stage for a confrontation that would definitively seal the technological verdict of the war. A column of King Tigers from the 524th Heavy Panzer Battalion slammed headlong into the lines of the Soviet regiments. In this clash of titans, the theoretical superiority of German armour was nullified by the metallurgical decay of the Reich's foundries. An acute shortage of manganese forced the enemy industry to employ a high-carbon steel alloyed with nickel, a recipe that produced plates of extreme hardness but fatal brittleness. Under impact, this steel did not yield. It shattered like glass, unleashing clouds of murderous internal spool and tearing weld seams apart along stretches of several meters, even without a direct penetration. Ballistic analyses conducted at the firing ranges painted a portrait of blind violence that rendered German technical refinement almost futile in the face of raw mass. Against the Panther tank, the results were dantesque. An impact from a 122mm shell on the frontal plate released such colossal kinetic energy that the projectile often traversed the entire interior to exit through the rear, while simultaneously ripping the turret from its rails by the sheer force of the shockwave. Against the first-generation Tiger, the Soviet gun acted like an oversized forge hammer. A direct hit not only pierced the frontal face, but the residual energy was regularly sufficient to blow the rear armour plate, 82mm thick, clean out of its mountings. Nevertheless, the engineers stumbled upon a ballistic paradox that defied intuition. It was discovered that the standard sharp-nosed armour-piercing shell, the BR-471, frequently ricocheted off the sloped surfaces of enemy tanks at distances exceeding 600 meters. The answer was a deceptive technological regression. The introduction, in the spring of 1945, of a blunt-nosed shell, the BR-471B, capped with a ballistic windshield. This obtuse shape prevented the projectile from sliding across the sloped steel. Instead, it bit into the metal and normalized itself perpendicular to the plate, drastically increasing penetration capabilities against the most modern armoured vehicles. Despite everything, the IS-2 remained a giant with feet of clay in a duel of precision. Its archaic fire control system and mediocre optics condemned it to inferiority against a Panther which, with its monoblock ammunition, could adjust 3 surgical shots while the Soviet crew was still wrestling to insert their second charge. With only 28 shells in the ammunition bays compared to 82 for its rival, the IS-2 was not destined to be an elegant hunter, but a brutal siege ram. This identity as a demolition hammer would soon become its sole raison d'etre, as the open plains were left behind in favour of the stone labyrinths of European metropolises, where range meant nothing in the face of the invisible threat lurking in every cellar. With the surge of the Red Army into the dense urban sprawls of Königsberg and Berlin, in the year 1945, the ballistic advantage of heavy guns at long range suddenly lost its tactical significance. Within the narrow stone canyons of the cities, the IS-2, originally conceived for duels at 2,000 metres, was metamorphosed into an inert target for a weapon that cost little more than a bicycle, the Panzerfaust. Lost statistics from the street fighting revealed a terrifying anomaly, as up to 70% of all destroyed heavy vehicles were eliminated not by enemy tanks, but by these portable shaped charge weapons fired by solitary infantrymen from cellar windows or heaps of rubble. To counter this asymmetrical threat, technical units initiated a desperate improvisation, welding anything they could scavenge from the ruins onto the outer shells of their tanks, from simple wire mesh to bed springs looted from German bedrooms. These grotesque-looking cages were intended to trigger the shaped charge's detonation before it could reach the main armour, leaving, in the best-case scenario, only a small molten dimple on the steel plate that the soldiers sardonically nicknamed the Witch's Kiss. However, the reality of these makeshift protective measures was often fatal. and the consequences of a successful hit revealed the structural trap that the tank represented in an urban environment. A penetration of the fighting compartment did not systematically lead to the ammunition's detonation, but it frequently ignited hydraulic oil or fuel, mechanically imprisoning the crew inside. Technical reports from recovery teams noted that the heavy hatches often became warped by the intense heat or remained jammed from within, forcing rescuers to use blowtorches to gain access to the charred interior. To minimise this risk, a paradoxical order was issued to close the hatches in combat but never to secure their internal locks, which in turn increased the likelihood of an enemy hand grenade being tossed into the turret from the upper floors of buildings. In response to this tactical dead end, units developed a formation known as the fir tree, where two heavy tanks advanced alternately on each side of a street, with each turret monitoring the opposite row of buildings to provide cover for its partner. In this role as a mobile siege gun, the 122mm piece finally demonstrated a brutal effectiveness that had nothing to do with classical tank duels. A single high-explosive shell was sufficient to pulverize a fortified machine gun nest along with the thick brick wall sheltering it, or to structurally destabilize entire building facades until they collapsed. Thus, the IS-2 did not end the war as an elegant hunter, but as a crude demolition crew on tracks, carving its way through pure destructive force. Yet while the victory parades were being prepared in Berlin, and the world believed the history of this iron colossus had concluded, an absurd second career awaited it, taking it far beyond the borders of Europe and keeping it in service for decades longer than physical reason should have allowed. Against all military logic, the operational odyssey of this colossus did not terminate with the capitulation of the Third Reich. Instead, it entered a phase of almost grotesque longevity, where this Iron Age vehicle proved more tenacious than its supposedly avant-garde successors. While the futuristic IS-3 models, with their pike-nose hulls, and the over-engineered IS-4 were relegated to the scrap heap or reserve, shortly after the conflict due to abysmal structural flaws and maintenance nightmares, the archaic IS-2 remained the backbone of the heavy tank regiments. In the year 1957, at a time when the world had long since entered the atomic age, Soviet engineers subjected this veteran to a radical rejuvenation cure under the designation IS-2M, an attempt to fuse Second World War technology with the imperatives of the Cold War. As part of this modernization, the tank received the V-54 KIS engine, originally developed for the T-54 medium tank, along with TVN-2 night vision devices, which theoretically transformed the vehicle into a nocturnal predator. A particularly telling detail of this improvised overhaul was the removal of the fixed rear machine gun in the turret. The aperture was hastily welded shut and replaced by an additional ventilator, as the accumulation of toxic powder gases remained an unresolved public health crisis for the crews even after more than a decade of service. Thanks to an optimization of the internal layout, the ammunition stowage was increased to 35 shells, an improvement certainly, but one that still felt like a meagre ration when measured against Western standards. These technological Frankenstein's monsters were subsequently exported to the four corners of the globe, emerging in conflicts for which they were never envisioned. Chinese volunteer units deployed the IS-2 during the Korean War against American forces, and the heavy tank even found itself mired in the deep jungles of Indochina. It was there that a military historical curiosity occurred. French forces transported a captured German Panther tank all the way to Vietnam, solely to experimentally verify whether German engineering from the 1940s could still surpass its Soviet counterpart in a tropical theatre. Later, 2 regiments of these machines ended up in Cuba, where, stripped of their mobility, they were partially buried as stationary coastal batteries, waiting in their concrete sarcophagi for an invasion that never materialized. Even in its homeland, the old scrap iron found no rest. When relations with China deteriorated in the 1970s, the remaining IS-2M tanks were moved to the Far Eastern borders and integrated into concrete casemates as fixed firing points. It is a crowning irony of fate, and an unprecedented technical anachronism, that the official decommissioning order for this tank, originally conceived as an answer to the Tigers of 1943, was not signed by the Russian Ministry of Defense until the year 1995, half a century after its original war had evaporated into the ashes of history.